South Korea outspends the entire world on luxury goods per person. It also holds one of the highest household debt ratios in the developed world, a youth credit crisis at an 11-year high, and the lowest birth rate ever recorded anywhere on Earth. These are not contradictions. They are the same fact stated twice. When an entire generation realizes the traditional markers of stability, a home, a family, a future, are structurally out of reach, luxury becomes something else entirely. Not a reward, a replacement. And recently, the label of choice has quietly shifted from the French houses to American heritage brands, Ralph Lauren, Coach, because their aesthetic says something specific that the wearer was never trying in the first place. This video is about the gap between that signal and the reality underneath it. The domestic luxury market in South Korea was valued at $669 billion in 2024. It is projected to reach $10.49 billion by 2034. This growth is not being driven by the old money families of Gangnam, the chaebol heirs who have held generational wealth since the 1970s. It is being driven by people in their 20s and 30s who hold the highest debt-to-income ratios of any demographic in the country. The MZ generation, Korean shorthand for millennials and Generation Z combined, now accounts for nearly half of all luxury purchases at major department stores. A Gallup Korea survey found that 62% of South Koreans in their 20s report feeling financially insecure despite being fully employed. These two facts are sitting in the same room, and no one in the room is speaking about it. The shift happening now within that consumption pattern is where the story sharpens into something precise. For decades, the European houses, Chanel, Louis Vuitton, Gucci, were the undisputed arbiters of Korean status. They were the language the aspirational class spoke. Then the pandemic ended, the price hikes came, and the already stretched Korean middle class found the entry point to European luxury not just expensive, but sealed. So the market pivoted. Ralph Lauren reported a 3.1% sales increase. Coach recorded double-digit growth. American heritage brands, once considered the default wardrobe of Ivy League universities and New England weekends, became the new armor of urban soul. The reason is not simply price, it is semiotics. The old money aesthetic, its unbranded quiet, its suggestion of wealth that is never needed to announce itself, offers something European logos no longer can, the appearance of not caring. In a society that will silently judge you for every visible choice, wearing something that looks like it was inherited rather than purchased is the most sophisticated camouflage available. That camouflage has a name in Korean cultural vocabulary. It is Che-myeon. It translates roughly as saving face, but that translation undersells it. Che-myeon is not vanity. It is the Confucian architecture of social survival. The understanding that your visible dignity, your projected worth, must never crack in public regardless of the private catastrophe underneath. Che-myeon does not allow you to wear your financial despair. It demands that you dress above it, and so an entire generation is doing exactly that, using high-interest credit to fund a presentation of effortlessness they cannot afford in a country that has given them no other ladder to climb. To understand how a country arrives at this specific moment, you have to go back to a point when there was no ladder at all. In 1953, South Korea's gross national income per capita was $67. The peninsula had survived Japanese colonial occupation for 35 years, followed immediately by a war that reduced its cities to rubble. The country was, by every metric, among the most destitute on Earth. The government's response was not gradual. It was total. Under the authoritarian leadership of Park Chung-hee, the state channeled its resources into a small group of family-owned conglomerates, the chaebols, Samsung, Hyundai, LG, SK. These entities received tax incentives, government contracts, and protected markets, and in exchange, they were expected to industrialize a nation in a single generation. The societal contract forged in that moment was explicit. Citizens would work without question, endure conditions that in other countries would have produced revolts, embrace the pali-pali culture, the hurry-hurry ethos of speed and optimization that built highways and semiconductor plants faster than any nation in history. And in return, they would have lifetime employment, upward mobility, and the promise that the next generation would live better than the last. For 3 decades, the contract held. A middle class appeared almost from nothing. The trauma of poverty was metabolized into the energy of accumulation. Then 1997 arrived. The Asian financial crisis, known inside Korea simply as the IMF crisis, brought the nation to the edge of sovereign bankruptcy. The bailout came with conditions. Labor laws were rewritten to allow corporations to shed their permanent workforce and replace it with temporary contract workers. Lifetime employment, the foundational promise of the entire social contract, was terminated overnight. The income gap that had been slowly widening began to accelerate. The middle class fractured. A generation that had built its entire psychological framework around the reliability of the system watched the system liquidate its obligations and walk away. What the 1997 crisis did was not merely economic, it was epistemic. It destroyed the belief that the deal was real. The post-crisis decades compounded the damage in one final decisive way. Seoul's housing market detached entirely from median income. The Jeonse system, Korea's unique leasing model requiring lump sum deposits often equivalent to hundreds of thousands of dollars, became a financial instrument that effectively excluded young people from independent living. The arithmetic became undeniable. Decades of disciplined saving would never equal the price of an entry-level apartment in the city where all the jobs were. The young Korean facing that arithmetic made a logical decision. If the future cannot be purchased, the present would be lived in. If a home is impossible, a German luxury car would do. If raising a child is financially suicidal in a country with no structural support for families, that capital would go elsewhere. The Sampo generation, so named for the three things its members gave up, dating, marriage, and childbirth, was not a cultural trend. It was a rational response to a structural trap. What is happening inside the minds of the people living this is the part that is hardest to see from the outside, and the part that matters most. Social comparison theory, the psychological framework established by Leon Festinger in 1954, holds that human beings determine their own worth by measuring themselves against those around them. In a densely packed city like Seoul, where proximity to success and failure is inescapable and social media has made the comparison continuous and global, this mechanism does not function as background noise. It functions as the primary operating system. Coupled with nunchi, the Korean art of reading the room, of sensing exactly where you stand in any social configuration, the pressure to appear viable is not occasional, it is hourly. A McKinsey report found that only 22% of Koreans believe displaying luxury goods is in bad taste, compared to significantly higher figures in neighboring countries. Korea is not a society where conspicuous consumption is tolerated. It is one where its absence is the thing that draws judgment. Beneath the social comparison runs something darker. Psychologists call it learned helplessness, the state that emerges when a person is subjected, repeatedly, to conditions beyond their control until they stop trying to change the conditions and instead adapt their behavior to survive them. When the macro environment offers no upward mobility, when the chaebol hierarchy is effectively sealed. When home ownership is mathematically impossible and every institutional path to stability has been quietly closed, the individual's sphere of control collapses to almost nothing. Buying a designer bag is not irrational inside that collapse. It is the last available act of agency. It is a person exercising the only muscle the system has left them. This is deepened by what behavioral economists call mental accounting, the cognitive process by which people assign different emotional values to the same currency depending on what it is designated for. Because the long-term goal of buying a home has been filed in the mental category of impossible, the money that might theoretically go toward it does not feel like savings. It feels unmoored. It migrates, almost without conscious decision, into the account labeled right now. The debt taken on for a luxury purchase is not experienced as debt against a future. It is experienced as the cost of surviving the present. That distinction, small as it sounds, is the entire logic of the Korean youth credit crisis. And then there is the specific choice of American heritage over European logo, which reveals something more precise still. Young Koreans are not unaware that the system is rigged. They understand with clarity the Sujo framework, the spoon class theory that categorizes people entirely by the wealth they were born into. The Gyeom Sujo, the gold spoon, inherits access. The Haeuk Sujo, the dirt spoon, inherits debt. The framework is fatalistic by design, and its adoption by an entire generation signals not cynicism, but accuracy. What the old money aesthetic does, worn over that awareness, is provide psychological armor against the stigma of being seen to try. In a society that punishes failure viciously and grades effort harshly, the worst possible signal is visible desperation. A European logo says, "I am trying to reach something." An American heritage brand says, "I was always already here." The first is dangerous, the second is safe. The cost of maintaining that safety across years, across credit card cycles, across the quiet erosion of possibility is the thing nobody in the boutique is allowed to say out loud. Minji is 26. She is an entry-level corporate contract worker in Seoul, one of thousands cycling through short-term positions in the city's glass towers, never quite securing the permanent role that would grant her access to health benefits, stability, and the possibility of a future. Every morning, she applies her makeup with the precision her environment demands, slings a $3,000 Ralph Lauren leather bag over her shoulder, emotes purchased across 2 maxed credit cards after Chanel moved beyond even aspiration, and rides the subway into work. She speaks without words the language of unbothered wealth. Her colleagues read it correctly. Nobody asks. At the end of the day, Minji does not return to an apartment. She returns to a goshiwon. Originally designed as temporary study rooms for students preparing for civil service exams, goshiwons have become the permanent housing of Seoul's urban working poor. Her room is 3.5 square meters. There is no window. She shares 1 bathroom with 30 other tenants. The walls transmit every sound from the adjacent room. She hangs the Ralph Lauren bag on a plastic hook above the cot that is also her desk and her dining table. The bag costs more than a full year of her rent. It is, in the most precise sense possible, the most expensive thing in the room, and it is the only thing in the room that no one outside the room will ever see. Minji is not a symbol, she is not a metaphor. She is a composite of documented cases of real people whose living arrangements and credit card statements have been studied by researchers and recorded by journalists. She is the point at which the macroeconomic forces of this story compress into a single human reality. A bag hanging on a hook in a windowless box, worth more than the box itself, purchased to avoid the social cost of being seen without it. Korea's crisis is not a Korean problem. In China, the response to nearly identical conditions, a 996 work culture demanding 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, inside an unaffordable housing market, has taken a different form. The Tangping movement, which translates as lying flat, emerged as a quiet refusal. Chinese youth are opting out of the race not through consumption but through withdrawal. Asceticism, minimalism, the deliberate rejection of productivity as identity. The South Korean response chose the opposite direction. Both are forms of giving up on the system. One starves it, the other binges. The psychology underneath is identical, a generation that has concluded the deal was never real and has stopped pretending to believe in it. Japan offers the longer view. Following its own economic crash in the early 1990s and the lost decades that followed, Japanese youth evolved into what sociologists called the Satori generation, a demographic characterized by a monk-like detachment from material desire, home ownership, and ambition. South Korea has not arrived there yet. It is still in the manic phase, the stage where the adrenaline of debt-fueled consumption masks the underlying resignation. Japan is where Korea is going. The quiet comes later. First comes the spending. In the United States, the phenomenon is called doom spending, the documented pattern by which Gen Z and millennials, confronted with climate anxiety, political instability, unaffordable housing, and student debt that will define their financial lives for decades, respond by purchasing high-end skincare, premium audio equipment, and experiences they cannot sustain. The mechanism is the same as souls. When the promise of the future is functionally canceled, the present gets monetized. The American version simply has a different aesthetic and a different set of rationalizations. The debt is real in both places. The despair underneath the spending is identical. South Korea is not a stage that other countries will somehow avoid. It is a data point in a sequence that is already running everywhere, at different speeds, under different cultural vocabularies, but driven by the same engine. The full optimization of a society for economic output without any corresponding investment in the conditions of human flourishing produces this. It produces a generation that cannot afford children, cannot afford homes, cannot afford futures, and responds by purchasing the most expensive possible version of right now. Korea reached that point first and reached it most visibly because it ran the experiment hardest and fastest. The rest of the developed world is running the same experiment at a slightly more comfortable pace and calling the results a consumer economy. The final question this video leaves you with is not about Korea. It is about what you have decided to stop waiting for. It is about the purchase you made last month that you understood, somewhere beneath the rationalization, was not a treat but a trade. Your future self paying for your present self's need to feel like things were still fine. It is about the specific way a culture teaches you to perform stability you don't have, and the specific cost, counted not in credit card interest, but in the slow reorientation of your life around the performance. South Korea has simply done this faster, louder, and with more precision than anyone else. The K-pop concerts, the glass towers, the heritage bag on the subway. These are not signs of a culture that has succeeded. They are signs of a culture that has learned to make failure look exactly like success, and has exported that skill to the world so effectively that we have all, to some degree, started practicing it. The luxury lie is not Korean. Korea simply had the misfortune of telling it first, and telling it well enough that everyone else mistook it for the truth.